Fat Controller. This is a story about me, Sir Topham Hatt, or the Fat Controller, as my engines call me. I have loved trains ever since I was a boy, but the engines are sometimes as troublesome as trucks. One morning the Fat Controller was eating his usual breakfast of toast and marmalade. Lady Hatt was pouring him a cup of coffee when the telephone rang. "Bother that telephone," said the Fat Controller, frowning. "I'm sorry, my dear," he said to Lady Hatt a few minutes later. "The engines are not behaving themselves. I must go at once. Engines on my railway do as they are told." When he arrived at the main station, there was a tremendous noise. The passengers were angry. The Fat Controller went into his office and sat down behind his desk. Moments later, the station master knocked on the door. "There's trouble in the shed, sir," he said. "Henry is sulking. There is no train, and the passengers are saying this is a bad railway." "Indeed," said the Fat Controller, "we cannot allow that." At the sheds, the Fat Controller found Gordon, James and Henry looking very cross. "Come along, Henry, it's time your train was ready," said the Fat Controller firmly. "Henry's not going," said Gordon. "We won't shunt like common tank engines. That is Thomas's job. We are important tender engines. Fetch our coaches and we'll pull them." "Tender engines don't shunt," huffed Henry. "Oh, indeed," said the Fat Controller. "We'll see about that. Engines on my railway do as they are told." And he hurried away in his car to find Edward. The yard has never been the same since Thomas left to run his branch line. He thought sadly and he took out a handkerchief to mop his brow. Meanwhile, Edward was shunting. "Leave those trucks, please, Edward," said the Fat Controller. "I want you to push coaches for me in the yard." "Thank you, sir. That will be a nice change," said Edward happily. "That's a good engine. Off we go then." So Edward found coaches for Gordon, James and Henry, and their trains ran as usual. But the next morning Edward looked unhappy. Gordon came clanking past, he hissing rudely. "Bless me," said the Fat Controller, "what a noise!" "They all hiss me, sir," sighed Edward. "They say tender engines don't shunt, that I have dirty wheels like trucks. I haven't, had I, sir?" "You have nice blue ones, Edward," said the Fat Controller kindly. "Tender engines do shunt, but we need another tank engine here." The Fat Controller went to the workshop and inspected all sorts of engines. At last he saw a little green tank engine with 4 wheels. "That's the one," he thought, the Fat Controller. He knew a really useful engine when he saw one. "If I choose you, will you work hard?" he said. "Oh yes, sir," peeped the little green tank engine. "That's a good engine. I'll call you Percy," smiled the Fat Controller, and he drove him all the way back to the yard. "Edward," he called, "here's Percy. Will you show him what to do?" Percy soon learnt what needed doing, and he and Edward had a happy afternoon. Then Henry steamed by hissing as usual. "Wee," shuttled Percy's back. Henry was so surprised he almost jumped off the track. The next day the Fat Controller arrived. Edward, Thomas and Percy were excited. He told the engines that Henry, Gordon and James were sulking. They refused to shunt like common tank engines, so I have shut them in the sheds. I want you to run the line for a while. Common tank engines indeed. Common tank engines indeed, snorted Thomas. "Will show them, and Percy will help too." "Thank you, sir," whistled Percy in delight. Edward and Thomas worked on the main line, peeping to each other as they passed by. Percy puffed along the branch line carrying passengers to their stations, but Thomas was worried about Annie and Clarabel, but his driver and guard promised to look after them. There were fewer trains, but the passengers didn't mind. They knew that the 3 naughty engines were being taught a lesson. In the sheds, Gordon, Henry and James were cold, lonely and miserable. There was no coal for them, no washdown, and they missed their passengers. They wished they hadn't been so silly. The next morning the Fat Controller visited the sheds. He could see that the engines had learnt their lesson. "We're sorry, sir," said Gordon. "We're too big for our buffers," added James. "Remember, only you really useful engines can work on my railway," said the Fat Controller. He just knew how to handle difficult engines. From that moment on, the 3 tender engines were never rude to the tank engines again. The end.